Hi guys, following on from the previous videos, we're just going to go over a very sort of brief recap over the comparisons, the comparison operators we went through in the first few videos. And then after that we're just going to look at if statements and else statements in Python. But first let's just go over the comparisons, the comparators quickly. So I'm sure we remember the more than comparison. So if I say 5 times 6, is that more than 11 times 2? And Python returns true, a true or false statement. 4 to the power of 3, is that equal to, using the double equals, 2 to the power of 6? And it happens to be true. So equals to, comparing two values to see if they're equal to each other. If I say the length of a string like hello world, so if I say the length of this string, and let's go with the less than the length of another string, I enjoy learning programming. Let's go for that. So the length of hello world, is it less than the length of I enjoy learning programming? Yes, it is. So that's another comparison we went through. Bringing back the div operator, how many times does 64 divide fully into 3? Is it equal to? Is it not equal to 19? And that's true. Remember, not equals is the exclamation mark with an equals. So 64 div 3 is not equal to 19, and Python returns true. And remember, mod is the remainder after division. So we're asking, is the remainder from 64 divided by 3, is it not equal to 3? And Python returns true. Because in fact we know the remainder should be 1, and 1 is not equal to 3. Another comparison, we remember with strings we can repeat them using the multiplication symbol. If I say hello world times 2, so hello world and then hello world again. So double it essentially and combine the two together. Is it less than I enjoy learning programming, that statement, in terms of length? So if I hit enter, yep, if I hit enter, oh, in fact, before I do that, let me string slice it. So let me select a particular set of characters from that string, from 2 up until but not including 15, and then take that length, and the answer is false. So now I'm going to start writing a slightly larger program by opening a new file and then saving that file to something like selection.py, which is what I've done. So I open a new new blank file, and I'm going to start programming. So what I want to do is write a program that lets the user enter two numbers, and then I want Python to compare the two numbers and find out which one's larger and smaller, or if they're equal to each other, and then check the divisibility of those numbers by certain other numbers. We'll see what you'll see what I mean as we start programming in this tutorial. So I'm going to start off with a print statement. Let's see, and print out a message such as enter two numbers, num1 and num2. So print, open brackets, and then in speech marks what I want, the message I want to be printed out, and then remembering to close brackets. Then I'm going to print or output to the user enter num1. Now I need a variable such as num1, and then the input function, the int input function. So it's an input which I'm taking in, but I want Python to interpret it as an integer. So I'm going to go num1 equals int input. So int brackets, and within those brackets input, open and close brackets again. So far I'm printing out the message enter two numbers, num1 and 2, then I'm printing out enter number 1 essentially, and then take in number 1 and num1 and store it as int input, so whatever the user inputs, and do exactly the same for number 2. And with number 2, I'm going for the message display using the second technique, which is to have the string message within the brackets of the input function. It's just the same way to do another way to do the same thing. So take in num1 and num2, store them as and interpret them as integers rather. So now I'm going to go for an if statement. If num1 is more than num2 colon, execute the following statements, and then the following statements are indented. So I'm going to say if num1 is more than num2, I'm going to say print num1 is larger. And if that's not the case, else if num1 equals to num2, I'm going to print out something like these two are equal. So just to go over it again, if num1 is more than num2 colon, execute the following, print num1 is larger. And if that's not the case, I say else if num1 equals to num2 using double equals, then I say print num1 and num2 are equal. And if that's not the case, then surely we know that num1 is less than num2, so in which case I might print num2 is larger. So these are the comparisons we're going for using the if and else statements. So if checks a condition to see if it's true. If that's not true and we want to check another condition, we can say else if, and as an alternative we can just say else. So that's our first part of our program, taking in two numbers or two integers and evaluating them to see which one is larger and which one is smaller, or indeed if they are equal, using the if and else commands. So now the next part of my program is for the user to enter a number or an integer and to check whether or not it's divisible by 5, 3, or in fact both. So again, I'm going to do the same thing and ask the user to enter a number, and I'm going to use the variable num1 once again. I'm just going to reassign it and let the user input a number, int input, followed by the string prompt or the string message you want to output to the user. So get num1 from the user. Now to check that a number such as num1 is divisible by 5 or 3 or whatever number it might be, we need to use the mod function. So the mod function, as we remember, if you recall, gives you the remainder after a division of two numbers. So if I was to say num1 mod 3, that would give me the remainder for when I divide number 1 by 3. If I divide the two together, if I divide number 1 by 3, if the remainder is 0, that means the division is complete. It's a complete division. In other words, num1 is divisible by 3. And it's exactly the same for num1 and 5. If the remainder is 0, then I know that num1 is also divisible by 5. So if I say if num1 mod 3 equals 0 and num1 mod 5 equals 0, then I know that the number is divisible by both. So the number the user entered is divisible by both 3 and 5, because the remainders from division are 0. So I print that statement. Else if, and elif is just a shortcut to say the same thing essentially. Else if number 1 is divisible by 3, or number 1 is divisible by 5. So it's essentially one or the other, but it's not both. Then I can say print num1 is divisible by only one of them. So the first if statement checks divisibility by both numbers 3 and 5. If that's not the case, we check for the divisibility of at least one of them, 3 or 5 again, using the or operator. So and or. There's a difference between the two. And requires both to be true, and or requires one to be true. And else, if none of those are true, then surely we know that the number that the user entered is not divisible by either 3 or 4, or all 5. So that's our if-else statement. If I now save and run this program, this is what happens on the Python shell. So the printed message, enter two numbers, number 1 and number 2. So if for number 1 I enter 34, for example, and number 2 I'm going to go for 67. Let's go for that. So the if statement, the first if and else statement, works out which one is larger, and it prints out num2 is larger, which is true. And now the second part of the program, just enter a number and we'll look at the divisibility by 5 and 3. So if I go for 75, we know that 75 is divisible by both, because the if and else statement does the comparison to check the remainder of divisions for 75 and 5, and then 75 and 3. Both of these conditions are satisfied, i.e. the remainder is 0, so the program prints out 75 is divisible by both. Now I just want to edit something from my previous program, and that is when we look at the divisibility by 5 and 3, at the moment if the number 1 is divisible by only one of them, I just print out that message, number 1 is only divisible by 1. But it would help actually if we were to find out exactly which one, 3 or 5, is it divisible by. So within that particular branch of my else and if statement, if and else statement, I'm going to go for another if and else, which is saying if number 1 is divisible by 3, i.e. the remainder from division by 3 is 0, then print out that it's specifically divisible by 3, and else if that's not the case, we know that it's divisible by 5, so I'm just going to print it's divisible by 5. It's a simple addition to the program, but it makes it clearer to the user which one, 5 or 3, is the number 1 divisible by. And again, if I run it, I am asked for two numbers, number 1 and number 2. So let's go for some different numbers here. Or we could go with the same ones, it doesn't really matter. 33 and 33 again. So the first part of the program, finding out which one's bigger or if they're equal, and the program correctly concludes that they're equal. And now going to the part of the program we changed, the divisibility by a number. So 125 is only divisible by 5, and the program specifically prints that.